Oil is no normal product. Of the myriad ways in which it is unique, 7 bear consideration for the utter change in circumstance the world is about to find itself in. Under normal circumstances, prices are the result of the relationship between supply and demand. Should supply rise while demand remains constant, prices will drop. Should demand rise while supplies remain constant, prices will rise. The inverse for both statements is true as well. This concept is called price elasticity, and it holds true for everything from skateboards to bread to potted plants to construction workers. Oil is different. Because oil is central to everything from the shingles on your roof to the phone in your hand to the spatula in your kitchen to the pipes and hoses in your plumbing to the diapers on your kid to the paint on your walls, a slight increase in demand for oil or a slight decrease in supply for oil results in wild price swings that are most assuredly not proportional. Perhaps even more important, oil is the transport fuel. No oil, and your car doesn't work. Neither does that giant container ship bringing you that shiny new washing machine from Korea. You must have it. The details vary from place to place and time to time, but a good rule of thumb is that a change in demand of about 10% results in a price shift around 75%. During the 2000s, when supply and demand were particularly out of whack, it didn't take long for prices to increase by 500%. Similarly, when the American subprime bubble burst in the context of a global financial crisis, the subsequent drop in demand quickly made oil give back some 4/5 of those price gains. All products travel the ocean, so all products face a degree of risk moving forward, but all products are not created equal. Whether you're evaluating the supply chain of cut lumber or mixing bowls, pretty much everything has different sources and supply routes that can become active as the market dictates. Oil is different. Since everyone has to have it, and since only a few places produce it in exportable volumes, the transport routes are far more concentrated. Even more problematic, the thickest of these supply lines are very long. Flows out of the Persian Gulf must travel between 5,000 and 7,000 miles to East Asian destinations, between 3,000 to 6,000 miles to European destinations, and 5,000 to 9,000 miles to North American destinations. Other minor suppliers aren't any better. Venezuela, for example, has on occasion shipped crude around South America and across the Pacific to northern China, a 12,000-mile journey that is the world's longest supply run, literally longer than halfway around the planet. Oil tankers are pretty easy to identify. They travel slowly, and they have little choice but to stick to the shortest possible route, which is already pretty long. For most of those oil shipments, there are no good alternatives. Nearly all oil that originates in the Persian Gulf must use the Strait of Hormuz. Even bypass pipelines have limited use since they terminate either on the eastern side of Hormuz or in the Red Sea, where shipments still need to go through either Suez or the Bab el-Mandeb. Bypassing the Strait of Malacca still requires punching through the Indonesian archipelago at a different location. And in the end, the terminus point for a lot of these shipments is an unavoidable location of difficulty, whether it be in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Sea of Japan, the Mediterranean, or the North Sea. One of the many transformative impacts of the order was the combining of the entire world into a single market. With few exceptions, products can flow from areas of high supply to high demand. For most products, this mellows any price shocks because there is typically extra stuff somewhere that can be used to pour fresh supply oil on troubled demand waters. Oil, with its price inelasticity, does the opposite. Any sudden change in supply or demand rapidly ripples throughout the entire system. For example, the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 98 may have only impacted oil demand on the margin and only on a regional basis, but those small changes crashed the price of crude by more than half. Globally, this locks much of the world into a bit of a suicide pact. Any disruptions that occur in any production zone or along any transport route will reverberate through the entire world. there will be a few exceptions, which fall into two general categories. First are those proto-empires that are able to militarily command shipments out of specific nearby production areas. Such interjections will not typically be clean, easy, or welcomed by the oil producers, but they will happen nonetheless. The second set of exceptions involves the major powers who produce the crude they need internally, and so can block exports with a few pen flicks or switch flips. In both types of regional systems, the economics of oil will echo models established in the pre-order world. Each system will have its own supply and demand mechanics, its own security risk premiums, its own crude grade patterns, and above all, its own pricing logic. The easiest of these pockets to predict is the United States. Most conventional oil wells take years of work to bring online, but shale wells only need a few weeks. Expect any price spikes in the soon-to-be sequestered American market to be easily ameliorated with a fairly even-keeled price structure topping out at roughly $70 a barrel. Canada will be brought along for the ride since all meaningful Canadian export infrastructure terminates on U.S. territory. A close second is Russia. While Russian civilian technological acumen has all but collapsed since the Cold War's end, so too has Russian industrial capacity. The end result has freed up 5 million barrels of oil and around 10 billion cubic feet of natural gas for daily export. The Russians have never been slaves to modern capitalistic norms, and the future will be no exception. Russian shortages in capital, labor, and technical command will erode away all of those exports. Under any scenario that doesn't involve mushroom clouds or extreme civil breakdown, the Russians will have more than sufficient energy for their own needs, at least until the early 2040s. And since Russia will in essence be a closed system, internal energy prices will be precisely what the Kremlin decrees them to be. Argentina is likely to experience an oil system not all that different from the United States. Despite some wildly creative approaches to economic management, Argentina already has the world's second most advanced shale sector, as well as all the infrastructure necessary to bring local shale output to its population centers. France and Turkey also look fairly good. Both are proximate to regional energy producers: Algeria and Libya for France, Azerbaijan and Iraq for Turkey, as well as sporting the local technical skills required to make those oil patches work. That said, securing said output will require a neo-colonial approach to their regions, and that will generate drama. The United Kingdom, India, and Japan are up next. All need to venture out, but all have naval forces more or less right-sized to reach potential sources. In this, the Brits have the easiest jaunts to make. Norway provides local supplies, while the British Navy can easily reach West Africa for the balance. The Indians look good too. The Persian Gulf is only a short hop away. Japan gets a bit dicey. Sure, Japan sports the world's second most powerful long-reach navy, but the Persian Gulf oil fields are a daunting 7,000 miles away. Of the countries that can secure their needs, it is Japan that will face the greatest risk of disruptions, shortages, and high prices. Outside of this short list of states, the picture darkens in every conceivable way. Without the supply redundancy and variety that has dominated the post-1945 world, any single shipment interruption spells immediate price explosions. Even worse, many of the world's oil suppliers are not in what I would call particularly stable areas. I'm looking at you, Iran, and Iraq, and Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and South Sudan, and Sudan, and Azerbaijan, and Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, and Nigeria, and Egypt. Should a field become damaged, either by militancy, war, incompetency, or lack of maintenance, it doesn't simply go offline. It goes offline for years. Expect prices to be wildly erratic, dropping below $150 a barrel only on painfully rare occasions, assuming supplies can be sourced at all. The backup isn't much of a backup. There's far more to global oil than just the major production zones in the Persian Gulf, former Soviet Union, and North America. It feels like some of them should be able to help smooth out the problems of the future. There is a little truth to this, but only a little. Consider the candidates. Let's start with the good news. The Western Hemispheric countries of Colombia, Peru, and Trinidad and Tobago. None are huge producers, but all are reasonably stable ones. In a post-order world, the Americans will establish a security cordon around the entire hemisphere to keep the Eurasian powers from dabbling. Trade will be allowed. Even the export of Latin American oil products to the Eastern Hemisphere will be seen as harmless, so long as no Eastern Hemispheric power establishes a footprint that the Americans perceive as strategic. This trio might not be big players. Collectively, we're not talking about much more than 1 million barrels per day. But at a minimum, the Americans can and will ensure maritime security for any transport on their side of the planet. Brazil is a bit more complicated. Most of Brazil's production is offshore, and most of its truly promising fields are not simply under 2 miles of ocean, but under an additional 2 miles of seabed. Brazilian energy presents very difficult operating environments, very high production costs, and a very challenging political backdrop. The problem is nothing less than the future coherence of Brazil as a state. The order has been perfect for Brazil. Large global markets, bottomless Chinese demand, cheap global financing. As Brazil's tropical and rugged geography saddles it with among the world's highest development costs for everything, that has been fantastic. It's all going away. And it just isn't clear if there will be sufficient, technically capable, capital flush foreign partners on the other side of the order. Even if the answer proves to be an enthusiastic yes, large-scale Brazilian output sufficient to generate large exports is a minimum of 2 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment away. Venezuela used to matter. It used to be among the world's most reliable producers and exporters. By many measures, decisions made in Caracas ultimately broke the Arab oil embargoes of the 1970s. Those days are long past. 2+ decades of horrific, deliberate, and increasingly creative and violent mismanagement all but destroyed the country's energy complex. Output is down by more than 90% from peak. Extraction and transport infrastructure is crumbling, and internal government leaks suggest irreparable damage to the country's petroleum reservoirs. Most of Venezuela's oil used to go to the United States, but American refiners have given up on Venezuela ever returning to the market, and so have retooled their equipment to operate using different input streams. With the Americans no longer interested, Venezuela no longer even has dedicated buyers for its specific ultra-heavy crude grades. Government finances have collapsed and taken down both food production and food imports with them. If Venezuela, and the correct word is if, is to contribute to global oil supplies, someone will need to deploy forces to the country to impose security, arrest the fall, and bring in billions of dollars of supplies to support the population and tens of billions to overhaul the energy infrastructure, all while convincing the Americans that they won't try anything cute. A slightly more likely outcome would be if one of Venezuela's oil regions, specifically the Maracaibo, were to secede from Venezuela and seek foreign protection, most likely either from the United States directly or from neighboring Colombia. That could potentially bring a couple of million barrels of daily output back to markets with an investment of only a few years and $30 billion or so. The Western African states of Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, and Angola have always been sketchy operating environments for foreign oil firms. It is largely a security issue. The African states have a poor track record of controlling their own territories, which often leaves foreigners prey to kidnapping, sabotage, or worse. And even that assumes oil production does not fall prey to internal political squabbles, which it does, constantly. In a post-order world, such internal security concerns are all but certain to intensify, which will force most foreign players to focus on very specific sorts of production, those in the deep offshore, dozens of miles from the coastline. Such offshore platforms will by necessity need to be militarized to prevent pirate assault. The Western countries most likely to play are those that have the most proximity to the West Africans, as well as the technical and military capacity to reach them: the United Kingdom and France. Such offshore platforms will by necessity need to be militarized to prevent pirate assault. The Western countries most likely to play are those that have the most proximity to the West Africans, as well as the technical and military capacity to reach them: the United Kingdom and France. There definitely are rough seas ahead, but it is this trio of African states that is likely to generate what little good news the oil markets of the Eastern Hemisphere will see in the next few decades. In Southeast Asia, the countries of Australia, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam are all reasonable producers. However, in recent decades, these countries have experienced sufficient economic growth that rising regional oil demand has gobbled up nearly all available regional supply. Collectively, these countries are no longer significant net exporters of oil, and that's before geopolitical preferences are factored in. This region is tightly bound together with not only manufacturing integration, but a series of largely friendly and cooperative political and security pacts. They would really prefer that the rest of an increasingly chaotic world would just butt out. They'd dig a hole and pull it in after them if they could. The North Sea is Europe's only significant remaining production zone, with the vast bulk of the output lying in the sea's Norwegian sector. The Norwegians enjoy excellent relations with their cultural cousins in Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, as well as their primary maritime neighbor, the United Kingdom. To be perfectly blunt, this entire roster of countries is likely to find themselves on opposite sides of the table from both the French and Germans moving forward, and they are already on the opposite sides of barbed wire from the Russians. In order to preserve themselves, this collective is all but certain to take joint action to prevent North Sea energy from going anywhere except to the members of their group. That's great if you're in the club. Less so if you're not. Algeria has been a major producer for decades, and its output has helped mitigate some of the pricing chaos the Persian Gulf so reliably creates. That's not going to happen for much longer. In the post-order world, there will be exceedingly few countries that can look out for their own economic and security needs. And the country at the top of that very short list is France, which sits directly across the Mediterranean from Algeria. France was Algeria's former colonial master, and the breakup was rough. The best Algerian move will likely be to approach either Spain or Italy and offer them supplies so Algiers won't have to deal with the French. It might even work. Barring that, the Algerians can look forward to the French gobbling up their entire energy export capacity. At least the French will pay for it. Probably. Libya will get messier because it is, well, Libya. Home to at least 3 major insurrections, in the middle of an ongoing civil war, it is a place my gut tells me to simply write off completely. But then there's Italy. In a world in which former Soviet and Persian Gulf crude becomes constricted and France de facto takes over Algerian fields, Libya becomes Italy's only source of oil. Unless the Italians choose to give up on their country's existence, they will have no choice but to venture forth to secure Libya's major ports, Libya's production sites deep in the desert, and all the connecting infrastructure in between. Considering Italy's trademark disorganization, general out-of-practiceness when it comes to colonial occupations, and flat-out racism when it comes to Arabs, this little chapterette of history is certain to be entertaining and horrifying. So, how much is left? Factor out captive supplies in places like North America, the North Sea, North Africa, or Southeast Asia, and eminently disruptible supplies from the Persian Gulf and former Soviet space. Then put supplies for local demand in places like North America and Russia into a different bucket. And total, exportable, kinda sorta reliable supplies globally only amount to a paltry 6 million barrels per day versus a global demand of 97 million. There is more to oil than oil. No one simply puts raw oil in their tank. It must first be processed at a refinery. The supply chains of oil may not be nearly as complicated as they are for, say, computers, but the outcomes can be far more dramatic. No two crude oil streams have exactly the same chemical makeup. Some are gooey and laden with impurities, most commonly sulfur, which can make up to 3% of the crude oil by volume. Such crudes are called heavy sours. Some, like Canada's oil sands, are so heavy that they are solid at room temperature. Others are so pure they have the color and consistency of nail polish remover and are called light sweets. Between these extremes lies an entire world full of other possibilities, each with its own specific chemical makeup. Each of the world's hundreds of refineries has a preferred input blend, which in the case of many older refineries was tailored to a specific oil field. This, too, is an outcome of the order. In a safe world, there was nothing stopping crude from any particular source from reaching any particular processor. But post-order? Anything that scrambles upstream production patterns or midstream transport patterns also scrambles everything in the energy sector's refinery downstream. Running the wrong crude in the worst case can cause major damage to multi-billion-dollar facilities. Even in the best case, it is certain to trigger something called run loss, a not-so-fancy term that means exactly what it suggests. A certain percentage of the crude run through a refinery for processing is simply lost due to inappropriate input mixes. Run loss increases quickly when either a refinery is asked to do something that was not designed to do, or when it lacks access to the correct crude oil blend. The Europeans, for example, love diesel, and Russia's Urals blend, a medium sour crude, is pretty good feedstock for refining diesel. Interrupt Urals flows, replace Urals with a different crude grade, and the Europeans are going to face serious product bottlenecks even if they can somehow keep their refineries running at their designed capacity. Considering oil's price inelasticity issue, something as little as a 1% refinery loss can have massive impacts on customers. We're looking at a lot more than a 1% run loss moving forward. Most of the world's refineries were designed to run on lighter, sweeter crudes because they have fewer contaminants and so are easier to process. Today, most of the world's lighter, sweeter crudes come from American shale plays. Refurbishing refineries can be done, but it takes two things the new world will have in short supply: time and money. Besides, most retooling simply locks you into a new crude formula. In an unstable world, reliability of specific crude input streams can occur only if you are very close to the secure source. For most refineries, that's simply not a possibility. There's even more to oil than oil. There's also something called natural gas, which along with oil is one of the classic fossil fuels. In many ways, the two are similar. Both have the same three concentrations of supply: the Persian Gulf, the former Soviet Union, and North America. Both have the same three concentrations of demand: Northeast Asia, Europe, and North America. Both can be used for similar things, ranging from a transport fuel to a petrochemical feedstock. They do, however, have a critical difference that shapes their use, their prevalence, and their impact. Oil is a liquid. It can be moved by pipe or barge or tanker or truck and can be stored in a non-pressurized tank. Large oil tanks at major ports even have floating lids that rise and fall with the fill level. There's no way you are doing that with natural gas. It is a gas. Gases are difficult to contain and transport, and even if the gas itself is not flammable, and natural gas most assuredly is flammable, they tend to be explosive under pressure. This difference has a few direct outcomes. Because gases burn far more thoroughly than liquids, natural gas is one of the world's premier electricity generation fuels, while hardly anyone uses oil for direct power generation any longer. Although, boy howdy, several of those Persian Gulf countries burn oil for electricity a lot. When burned in a modern power facility, natural gas typically generates barely more than half the carbon dioxide emissions compared to coal. Most American reductions in CO2 emissions since 2005 have taken place because natural gas has been displacing coal in the American electricity fuel mix. Somewhat similar displacements are in play in much of the rest of the world, most notably Europe and China. Most natural gas that humans use is transported via pipe, which requires far tighter economic links between producer and consumer. As such, most piped natural gas is produced in the country from which it is sourced, making the geopolitics of natural gas far less sexy writ large than the geopolitics of oil. Of course, there are exceptions. Russia is the world's largest natural gas exporter, in large part due to legacy infrastructure left over from the Soviet era. But the Kremlin feels, not without merit, that piped natural gas generates geopolitical dependencies, and has extended its natural gas networks into Germany, Italy, Turkey, and China with an eye toward manipulating those countries' strategic policies. Results from the Russian viewpoint tended to be positive until they started invading their customers' neighbors. Natural gas can be chilled and pressurized and transported by ship, but that is expensive and requires specialized infrastructure, and so is only done with about 15% of the total. The supply-demand math for this liquefied natural gas, or LNG, is reminiscent of that for oil. Most LNG comes from Qatar, Australia, Nigeria, or the United States, and goes to Europe or especially Northeast Asia. That means when it comes to LNG shipments, producers and consumers alike should expect disruptions in natural gas supply as they will for oil. Taken together, these three differences don't necessarily spell out a brighter future for this corner of the global energy system, but instead a different kind of dark. And dark is the word. Oil is primarily used for transport fuel, so shortages slow human interaction to a crawl. Natural gas is primarily used for electricity generation, so shortages mean the lights literally go out. The most vulnerable locations are those most dependent upon massive natural gas flows from or through the territories and waters of countries that are less than reliable. Korea, Taiwan, Turkey, China, Ukraine, Germany, Austria, Spain, Japan, France, Poland, and India, roughly in that order. One more fun fact: natural gas is vital to places that lack it. Northeast Asia and Western Europe, most notably. They regularly pay $10 per 1,000 cubic feet for the stuff and must navigate tetchy producers and tetchier transit states and outright hostility from neighbors. In the Ukraine war's opening act, prices quickly topped $40. But in the United States, natural gas is frequently a byproduct of its shale sector's oil efforts. The Americans often have to flare the stuff because they cannot build out their distribution infrastructure fast enough to capture it all. Once it is captured, it is typically sold into the system at or near zero, and even adding in processing and transport costs, most American end users get access at something less than 1/4 the cost of the rest of the world. Change the global system, and the only tweak the Americans might make in their natural gas setup is to start to produce some more on purpose so that they can process it into finished products for sale abroad. Finally, there's the fire on the horizon. Climate change. I'm sure many of you are wondering how I can go this far into a chapter on energy with barely an oblique mention of climate change. It's not that I don't buy the math. In a previous life, I was in training to be an organic chemist. The idea that different gases sport different heat trapping and light reflecting, the technical word is albedo if you want to sound smart, characteristics is pretty basic science, with well over a century of evidence behind it. No, that's not the problem. The problem is more involved. First, I work in geopolitics. Geography, locations, the study of place. How dozens of geographic factors interconnect to shape how culture, economics, security, and populations emerge and interplay. If you tell me the whole world is going to heat up by 4 degrees, I can tell you how that will play out. But that is not what is happening. Just as different gases have different heat-trapping and light-reflecting characteristics, so too do different climates. and land covers and latitudes and altitudes. We're not looking at an even heating, but instead an extremely uneven heating that has more of an impact on land versus water, on the Arctic versus the tropics, on cities versus forests. That affects not only local temperatures, but regional wind patterns and global ocean currents. Such inconsistency does far more than add one more variable to the mix of latitude, elevation, humidity, temperature, soil composition, surface angle, and so on that allows me to read the planet. The entire map of everything is changing. We've only started parsing out the localities of climate change within the past few years. For the purposes of this specific chapter, we'll only be dealing with the technicalities and applicability of green tech from the angle of energy production and substitution, as opposed to the specific economic and strategic outcomes of climate change. Since everything is changing, it is critical to first establish a solid baseline. That's why I'm dealing with climate change last rather than right out of the box. Second, no matter what happens politically or technologically, we are nowhere near being done with oil. The dominant environmental concern with all things oil has been about carbon dioxide emissions. But technologies like the internal combustion engine that burn oil products to produce those emissions are hardly the only things that use oil. Oil is also the base material for the bulk of the world's petrochemical needs. That sector is not a rounding error. Modern petrochemicals are responsible for the bulk of what we today consider normal, comprising the majority of the inputs in food packaging, medical equipment, detergents, coolants, footwear, tires, adhesives, sports equipment, luggage, diapers, paints, inks, chewing gum, lubricants, insulation, fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. And the second largest component of material inputs in paper, pharmaceuticals, clothes, furniture, construction, glass, consumer electronics, automotive, home appliances, and furnishings. Oil-derived transport fuels do constitute the majority of oil use, nearly 3/5 to be specific. But petrochemicals account for a full 1/5. That's about as much as the entire Persian Gulf exports in a typical year. Many of these products do have potential substitute inputs. But in nearly all cases, that substitute is natural gas. Move beyond fossil fuel possibilities, and either the cost of the substitute is in excess of 10 times that of the original input, the carbon footprint is in excess of 10 times that of the original input, or more likely, both. Green tech does not make a country immune to geopolitics. It just shifts the view. Climate, temperature, land cover, resource location, distance, and maritime choke points are hardly the only geopolitical factors. So too are latitude, elevation, humidity, temperature, surface angle, wind speed, wind reliability, solar radiation, and seasonal weather variation. Just as different geographic features impact deepwater navigation and industrialization differently, or manufacturing and finance differently, so too do they impact green tech and conventional power generation differently. And if the tech is of varying usefulness based on location, then there are relative winners and losers, just as there are with deepwater transport or industrialization or oil. Me personally, I used to live in Austin and now reside just outside Denver. I've put up solar systems on both homes. In hot, sunny Texas, I recouped my investment in under 8 years. It'll likely take less time living in Colorado. Denver is the United States' sunniest metro area, and at high altitude there is no humidity and very little air to block sunlight. I'm absolutely a believer in the technology when it's matched to the correct geography. Most parts of the world are neither very windy nor very sunny. Eastern Canada and Northern and Central Europe are cloud-bound for more than 9 months of the year on average, in addition to having painfully short winter days. No one goes to Florida or northern Brazil to kiteboard. The eastern two-thirds of China, the vast bulk of India, and nearly the entirety of Southeast Asia, home to fully half the world's population, have so little solar and wind potential that a large-scale green tech build-out would emit more carbon than it would ever save. Same for West Africa and the northern Andes, and the more populated portions of the former Soviet Union, and Ontario. Zones for which today's green tech makes both environmental and economic sense comprise less than 1/5 of the land area of the populated continents, most of which is far removed from our major population centers. Think Patagonia for wind, or the Outback for solar. The unfortunate fact is that green tech in its current form simply isn't useful for most people in most places, either to reduce carbon emissions or to provide a substitute for energy inputs in a more chaotic post-order world. I live in a rural area, and my home sprawls accordingly. I've got a 10-kilowatt solar system, which covers the majority of my south and west-facing roof lines and generates sufficient power for nearly all my needs. But what if I lived in a city? A smaller roof line means less room for panels. What if I lived in an apartment? My roof would be a shared space whose panels need to feed multiple units. What if I lived in a high-rise? Minimal roof space, lots of people drawing upon very few panels. Fossil fuels are so concentrated that they are literally energy in physical form. In contrast, all green techs require space. Solar is the worst of the bunch. It is roughly 1,000 times less dense than systems powered by more conventional means. Consider America's megalopolis, the line of densely packed cities from Boston in the north to the greater DC area in the south. Collectively, the coastal cities of this line comprise roughly 1/3 of the American population on a tiny footprint. They also happen to be positioned on patches of land with very low solar and wind potential. The idea they could generate sufficient volumes of electricity locally is asinine. They need to import it. The closest zone with reasonably good solar potential, not good, reasonably good, is South Central Virginia. That's an inconvenient 600 miles away from Boston, and Boston would be last in line for sips of electricity after DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, Hartford, and Providence. It isn't simply an issue for cities located in cloudy, still locations. It's a problem for cities everywhere. Every technological development that has brought us to our industrialized, urbanized present must be reevaluated to make today's green tech work. But by far the biggest challenge is the very existence of cities themselves. All are by definition densely populated, while green tech by definition is not dense. Squaring that circle even in sunny and windy locations will require massive infrastructure to bridge the gap between dense population patterns and far more dispersed green tech electricity generating systems. Such infrastructure would be on a scale and of a scope that humanity has not yet attempted. The alternative is to empty the cities and unwind 6,000 years of history. Even if solar and wind were equivalent technologies to oil, natural gas, and coal in terms of reliability, decarbonizing the grid would remain a mammoth task. Currently, 38% of global power generation is carbon-free, suggesting we'd only need to roughly triple the good slice to displace the bad. Wrong. Hydropower has already used all available appropriate geographies globally. Nuclear would first need a hell of a PR campaign to sufficiently improve its image. If only solar and wind are doing the lifting, they would need a 9-fold build-out to fully displace fossil fuels. Sixth, even in the geographies where green tech works well, it is, at best, only a partial patch. Green tech only generates electricity. Wind and solar might theoretically be able to replace coal in some specific locations, but electricity of any type is not compatible with existing infrastructure and vehicles that use oil-derived liquid fuels. Such a restriction naturally leads to discussion of electric vehicles as a wholesale replacement for those powered by internal combustion engines. Such is far more difficult than it sounds. The entirety of the global electricity sector generates roughly as much power as liquid transport fuels. Run the math. Switching all transport from internal combustion to electric would necessitate a doubling of humanity's capacity to generate electricity. Again, hydro and nuclear couldn't help, so that 9-fold increase in solar and wind is now a 20-fold increase. Nor are you even remotely done. You now need absolutely massive transmission capacity to link the locations where wind and solar systems can generate power to where that power would ultimately be consumed. In the case of Europe and China, those power lines would have to jump continents. You're also assuming minor little details break your way, such as the wind always blowing, or the sun never setting, or there never being hiccups in transmitting power from the Libyan desert to Berlin or the outback to Beijing. More likely, EVs with today's technology will work only if we double down on the very energy sources that environmentalists say we're trying to cut out of the system. In my not-so-humble opinion, we need to tackle first things first. We need to green the grid before we expand it. And unfortunately, the pace of that effort is painfully slow. From 2014, when the solar boom began, until 2020, solar has only increased to become 1.5% of total energy use. Seventh, the practical aspects of a potential switchover are beyond Herculean, both in terms of technical challenges and cost, and I am not talking about the relatively simple task of installing enough solar panels and wind turbines to generate 43,000 terawatt hours of electricity, roughly 70 times the total green tech build-out of 2010 through 2021. Part of what makes the modern world work is on-demand electricity. That requires something called dispatchability, the idea that a power plant can ramp its power output up and down to match demand. Not only can wind and solar not relatively simple task of installing enough solar panels and wind turbines to generate 43,000 terawatt hours of electricity, roughly 70 times the total green tech build-out of 2010 through 2021. Part of what makes the modern world work is on-demand electricity. That requires something called dispatchability, the idea that a power plant can ramp its power output up and down to match demand. Not only can wind and solar not do this, they are also intermittent. Power levels vary based on that most mercurial of forces, the weather. Hardware upgrades can prevent such surges from alternatively shorting out or browning out industrial and residential customers, but that's not free. Part of what makes dispatchability so attractive is that there are peaks and troughs in normal electricity demand. In most locations, peak electricity demand is between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m., with higher demand rates in the winter. Peak solar supply is between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m., with higher supply profiles in the summer. And that's before considering that the same panel will generate different amounts of power based on location. My panels in the highlands of Colorado would spit out less than 1/5 the power in the doldrums of Toronto. No amount of money enables us to ignore this little geographic problem. Unlike coal or natural gas, which can be pre-positioned, the wind blows where the wind blows and the sun shines where the sun shines. Any green tech generated electricity must then be wired to where it can be used. This is also not free, and often results in the doubling or more of the cost of the delivered power. The details vary massively based on where the power is coming from, where it will be consumed, the nature of the connecting infrastructure, what sort of political borders must be crossed, etc. It's no wonder that fully 95% of humanity sources its electricity from power plants less than 50 miles away. Addressing such issues requires a parallel power system. With the status of green tech technology in 2022, in most cases that parallel system is a boring, conventional system that runs on either natural gas or coal. Let me underline that. Green tech today is so unreliable in most locations that those localities that do attempt green tech have no choice but to maintain a full conventional system for their total peak demand, at full cost. Green tech in its current form simply isn't able to shave more than a dozen or so percentage points off fossil fuel demand. And even this achievement is only possible within geographies fairly perfect for it. A few places with good green tech potential have attempted to replace half of their pre-existing conventional power generation with green tech. But working around issues of grid capacity and intermittency and transmission results in a quadrupling of power prices. In California, the price increase is closer to triple, but that's because Cali cheats. California doesn't maintain a full backup fossil fuel system, but instead imports fossil fuel-derived power from neighboring states. In an act of accounting chicanery, California calls such imports zero carbon because the carbon was generated on the other side of the state line. There is a complementary technology out there that might, emphasis on the word might, be able to square these circles. Batteries. The idea is that green tech-generated power can be stored in batteries until such time as it is needed. Intermittency, dispatchability, supply-demand mismatches, all solved. Even transmission distances can be shortened in some cases. Just as oil's production is concentrated, so too is the primary input for the best battery chemistry of the day, lithium. And just as oil needs to be refined into usable products, raw lithium must be processed into concentrate, refined into metals, and then built into battery assemblies. Today's lithium supply chains require unimpeded access to Australia, Chile, China, and Japan. That's a bit simpler than oil, but not by all that much. Should anything happen to East Asia writ large, and all of East Asia is due for a great deal of happening, the bulk of the value-added system for batteries will need to be rebuilt elsewhere. That'll take time and money, a lot of it, especially if the goal is to apply lithium battery tech at scale. That scale is the second problem. Lithium batteries are expensive. They are the second or third most expensive component in the average smartphone, and that's a battery that stores but a few watt-hours. They comprise in excess of 3/4 the cost and weight of most electric vehicles, and that's a battery that stores but a few kilowatt-hours. City grid batteries require megawatt days. Achieving meaningful green tech power storage would require grid-level battery systems that could store a minimum of 4 hours of power to cover the bulk of that daily high-demand period. Assuming that the technological improvements in the world of batteries that have unfolded since 1990 continue into 2026, the cost of a 4-hour lithium grid storage system will be about $240 per megawatt hour of capacity, or 6 times that of the standard combined cycle natural gas plant, which is currently the most common electricity generating asset in the United States. Important note, that 6x figure does not include the cost of the electricity generating asset that actually charges the battery, nor the transmission asset to get the electricity to the battery. As of 2021, the United States had 1,100 gigawatts of installed electricity generation capacity, but only 23.2 gigawatts of electricity storage. Roughly 70% of that 23.2 gigawatts is something called pumped storage. In essence, using excess generated power to pump water uphill and then allowing that water to flow down a watercourse to power a generator as needed. Most of the other 30% is some sort of storage capacity located in people's homes. Only 0.73 gigawatts of storage is actually in the form of batteries. The American state that is most committed to the ideology of a green future is California. The state as a whole has but enough total storage, not battery storage, total storage, for 1 minute of power. Los Angeles, the American metropolitan area with the most aggressive plan for installing grid storage, doesn't anticipate reaching 1 hour of total storage capacity until 2045. Remember, that's 1 hour of storage for LA's current electricity system, not the doubling that would be required to realize the dream of universal EV adoption for cars and light trucks. Nor would that magical 4 hours be anything more but the first step on a long and tortuous road. A true shift to a carbon-neutral power system would require the capacity to camel not hours, but months of electricity for the seasons that are not as windy or sunny. We don't know everything about the world of energy, but we know for certain that there is not enough lithium ore on the entire planet to enable a rich country like the United States to achieve such a goal, much less the world writ large. Does this mean grid storage as a concept is stupid? Nah, not what I'm saying. Right now, most power utilities maintain a secondary fleet of power generation assets that only get turned on for peak heating and/or cooling needs a few days of the year. Those are some expensive paperweights. Not only does installing a single hour of grid storage enable the retirement of many of those peaker plants, but such storage capacity can be used every day to shave down the normal daily peak demand. Based on location and weather, that reduces fuel use by 4 to 8%. Apply that nationwide, while you're definitely not within reach of net zero, you're still talking about a lot of apples. In places with good solar or wind resources, most current price assessments suggest that the combined lifetime cost of fuel, maintenance, and installation for green tech versus conventional is more or less equal. From a financial point of view, the primary difference is when the capital must be committed. About 1/5 of the total costs for the entire lifespan of a conventional power plant are spent upfront on land acquisition and facility construction, with the rest dribbled out over decades for fuel purchase and facility maintenance. For green tech, nearly the entire cost is upfront, 2/3 upfront in the case of onshore wind turbines. After all, fuel costs are zero. In the capital-rich world of the late order, this is a footnote, and not a particularly important one at that. There is nothing wrong with financing 25 years of power bills up front when capital is cheap. But in the capital-poor world of the disorder, this could well be everything. Should investment capital become harder to source or borrowing costs go up, all such upfront investments degrade from an easy carry to unsatisfactorily risky and expensive. In that world, the far lower installation costs of conventional systems make a great deal more sense. Green tech in its current form simply isn't mature enough or cheap enough to move the needle for most peoples in most locations. It is largely limited to developed countries with rich capital supplies who just coincidentally happen to have large population centers fairly close to sunny or windy locations. The southwest quarter of the United States looks great, as do the American Great Plains, Australia, and the coasts of the North Sea. Nearly all other locations will remain dependent upon more traditional fuels for the vast majority of their energy needs. If they cannot source oil or natural gas, and their geographies do not enable sufficient use of solar and wind, they will have a simple decision to make. Option A is to do without the products that have enabled humanity to advance for the past 2 centuries, to suffer catastrophic reductions in product access and food production, triggering massive downward revisions to standards of living and population, to go without electricity, or option B, to use the one fuel source that nearly all countries have locally: coal. Many particularly unlucky people will be stuck with something called lignite, a barely qualifies as coal fuel that is typically 1/5 water by weight and is by far the least efficient and dirtiest fuel in use today. Germany already uses lignite as its primary power input fuel because green tech is so woefully unapplicable to the German geography, and yet the Germans, for environmental reasons, have shut down most of their other power generation options. Germans, not as smart as you might think. As a planet, we are perfectly capable of suffering broad-scale economic collapse and vastly increasing our carbon emissions at the same time.